Okay. We're ready. Anytime you want.
Okay, I'll kick off. All right, so welcome to part two. Part two is, of course, focused on liberty. Before we get into the liberty, a little bit of a refresher. So, three parts of a legitimation story. The state's act, X, is justified by legitimating abstraction, Y, understood through conceptualization, Z. So liberty is the legitimating abstraction that we're focusing on today. And we're going to talk about how liberty can be conceptualized, right? So the liberal triad, liberty, equality, and representation, those are the three legitimating abstractions that play the most central role in the United States legitimation stories. But then there are all sorts of further questions about how to conceptualize those abstractions. And today is focused on the first part, on liberty. So the one thing everybody is sure of is that liberty is not slavery. So whatever you think slavery is, liberty is definitely not that. Aristotle has a very precise, worked out, schematic notion of what liberty is, because he has a very worked out notion of what slavery is. And for Aristotle, slaves lack the capacity to choose their own ends. And importantly for Aristotle, some people are slaves by nature. So if you could be a slave by nature, then slavery is not purely a property relation. It's more fundamental than that. It's not being able to do something, right? If you don't have the capacity to choose your own end, for Aristotle, you are a slave, regardless of whether the political or legal system recognizes you as a slave, regardless of whether you have a particular master. And not only can you be a slave by nature, you can lack certain socioeconomic prerequisites for freedom. So what are all those prerequisites? Well, we start with the natural capacity. You have to have this ability to choose your own ends, this potential. But that potential will only be actualized if you have leisure time. And leisure time is not just time to relax. It's time that you can spend trying to become a better person, trying to learn things, trying to acquire virtues, right? So it's not mere amusement or play or entertainment time. It's growth-oriented time. And then, of course, you need appropriate education to be able to make use of that time. If you have leisure time, but you don't have appropriate education, then the time will not, even if it's not being used for amusement or play or entertainment, it still won't be used well. You'll still end up mistaken about certain things, or going down faulty paths, prioritizing the wrong things, right? So what are some of those other things? Well, instead of prioritizing virtue, maybe you prioritize what makes money or what makes you popular or cool or high status. For Aristotle, you can use leisure time to think about what makes money or what makes you higher status. But when you're doing that, you're making a mistake about how you use your leisure time. You're growing not for its own sake. You're not treating what you're doing as valuable intrinsically or substantively. You're instrumentalizing it for the purposes of making money or acquiring status. So appropriate education is necessary to distinguish between these vulgar instrumental ends and valuing the activity for its own sake, right? So if you have all three of those things, if you have the capacity to choose your own ends, that capacity is actualized by the presence of leisure time, and then appropriate education so that you use that leisure time to pursue the craft for its own sake, rather than money or status, then you've got freedom on Aristotle's conception. So you can then imagine several different types of people. So slaves, straightforwardly, don't get any of these things, right? They don't have the natural capacity or they don't have leisure time. The vulgar craftsman has natural capacity and leisure time, but not appropriate education. So the vulgar craftsman does crafts for the purposes of making money, gaining status, satisfying other people rather than for their own sake. The virtuous craftsman does activity for its own sake because the virtuous craftsman understands what is intrinsically valuable about the activity, right? Now, because of the way Aristotle has conceptualized freedom, on his schema, it's intrinsically scarce, right? So for one, it's hard to even get leisure time unless some number of people are slaves, because to free up your time, you need other people to take care of you and to meet your basic needs, to go out there and gather food, to build your house, to do all of these things that give you time to sit around and try to become a more virtuous person, right? So if you need some number of slaves for leisure time in the first instance, then it's not going to be the case that everybody in the society can be free. And of course, if you think that some people lack the natural capacity to choose their own ends, and Aristotle definitely does, then those people aren't going to be free. And if you've got some people who cannot distinguish between the vulgar and virtuous crafts, they may have leisure time and they may have some ability to pursue vulgar ends, but they're not able to see the intrinsic substantive value in their craft. Those people are not going to be fully free. They're going to be trapped in notions of what makes money or notions of what is cool, right? And it also raises this question of, does the state need to distribute time and education to make sure those things reach the people who have the time, have the natural capacity, have the potential to distinguish between the vulgar and virtuous crafts? And if the state has to get involved in distributing time and education to make sure that that comes off, then you have all these questions of whether the state will be able to distribute the time or distribute it effectively. And Aristotle comes up with a whole series of good regimes and bad regimes. And one of the distinguishing features of a bad regime is that it's not able to distribute time and education in such a way that large numbers of people achieve Aristotelian freedom. In particular, Aristotle does not think that vulgar craftsmen have achieved enough to merit participation in politics. So I've got a number of quotes from Politics 1278a here, in which Aristotle is very critical about vulgar craftsmen. He says, "The truth is that not everyone without whom there would not be a city-state is to be regarded as a citizen. The best city-state will not confer citizenship on vulgar craftsmen. If they too are citizens, then what we have characterized as a citizen's virtue cannot be ascribed to everyone, or even to all free people, but only to those who are freed from necessary tasks. Those who perform necessary tasks for an individual are slaves. Those who perform them for the community are vulgar craftsmen and hired laborers. In Thebes, there used to be a law that anyone who had not kept away from the market for 10 years could not participate in office." And here we see a very early critique of the effect of the market on people. Participation in the market tends to orient people toward what makes money. And for Aristotle, if you're oriented toward what makes money, you do not have the appropriate orientation for politics. And so he speaks favorably of that Theban law and seems to suggest it as a good principle around which to construct city-states. So this ancient conception of freedom, it's very demanding. It's very hard to universalize it. It requires heavy state intervention, even to allow minorities of people to get freedom. So as we move forward into the modern period, there's an interest in making freedom something that everybody can have. If you're going to say that the state is legitimate because it provides you with freedom, then you need a story about how the state is able to deliver on that abstraction. So you need to conceptualize the abstraction in a way that makes it easier for the state to be seen to be delivering on it, right? So Benjamin Constant offers an early account of how the state might be able to provide liberty. So he makes a distinction. In the ancient world, the world of people like Aristotle, liberty is to do with participation in politics. And because it's to do with participation in politics, it's focused on the public realm, right? So if you're participating in the public realm, you need virtue to put the public interest before your private interest. And so if you're going to be free in the ancient sense, it becomes very important to have virtue so that you put the public interest first. And Constant argues that ancient liberty comes about because in the ancient world, economic growth is driven by military conquest, and the citizen has to be a soldier. And so the citizen soldiers are deciding together when to fight wars, where to fight them, how to fight them. And since the wealth of the community is acquired through warfighting, public activity is closely tied to economic growth in antiquity, according to Constant. In contrast, Constant says that in modernity, economic growth is driven by trade, by the activity of merchants rather than the activity of soldiers. And the merchant is engaged in what Constant will describe as the private realm. And for merchants to be successful, they need to not be interfered with by the state. And so modern liberty becomes freedom to engage in private affairs, freedom to be a merchant, freedom to be a trader, right? Now, a trader can be vulgar. A trader can be someone who spends all their time in the market, and therefore someone who is focused on what for Aristotle are vulgar ends. So modern liberty doesn't require anything like as much virtue as ancient liberty. And therefore, if it doesn't require as much virtue, then the kind of education you need for modern liberty to obtain is much more limited and much less elaborate, right? So if all you're going for is modern liberty, non-interference, allowing people to be merchants or traders in a private realm, where you, if anything, kind of value their decision to prioritize what makes money over what might be in the interest of the collective, it becomes a lot easier to imagine that everybody could have liberty in that sense. And so by making this distinction, this dichotomy between ancient liberty and modern liberty, Constant is able to negate this more demanding, more difficult to universalize form of liberty in favor of a conceptualization of liberty that's much more accessible. Now, there are certain issues with the way that Constant draws this distinction. For instance, the Roman Empire, there were several centuries where the Roman Empire did not expand. And modern scholarship identifies that there are markets in the ancient world, and a lot of ancient states made a lot of money from trade. It is not as if the ancient world is all about war and the modern world is all about trade. But that's the schema that Constant drew up, in part for the purposes of articulating a notion of liberty that's easier to universalize. Now, there are a number of worries that Constant himself had about this conceptualization. And in his novel Adolf, he considers in particular the case of a man who is completely caught up in a romance and isn't participating in politics or even following the news, because he's completely focused on trying to win over this woman and the drama and the stress in his life that comes out of this romantic encounter. And so one of Constant's worries is that citizens might get so taken up with their private affairs that they'll allow tyranny. They'll become so uninterested in public affairs and in politics that they'll allow the government to exercise tyrannical power. If you still need some level of political participation from citizens, then you might need some level of virtue for them to exercise that political behavior effectively, for them to be effective participants. So if some level of virtue is necessary, then you have to ask this question of, can the private sphere adequately socialize people? Can it provide them with enough virtue? Now, of course, Aristotle would say that you need quite heavy-handed intervention to make sure that people acquire virtue. But if you don't need as much virtue as Aristotle says you need, but you still need some, then you can ask this question of whether private civil society organizations are enough. And when I say private civil society organizations, I mean things like churches, clubs, eventually labor unions, right? And then another question that comes up is can people be satisfied with private pursuits? One of the things that Constant observes in the French Revolution is that people very much wanted some kind of ancient liberty. There was a significant number of people who really didn't like living their life as a merchant or a trader or someone who has to be focused on money. And a number of people wanted to have a more political life than is really consistent with the maintenance of ancient liberty. So all of these questions come up in Constant. And so even though Constant is drawing this up rather dichotomously, there is an awareness in Constant's work of some of these other concerns, because Constant doesn't completely and straightforwardly negate ancient liberty. Now, alongside Constant's project, you have the German idea of freedom. The German idea of freedom, broadly speaking, it has lots of different incarnations, is freely choosing to submit to a principle through the development and exercise of universal natural capacities. Universal. So bear in mind, for Aristotle, it is not the case that everybody has the natural capacity to choose their own ends. And even insofar as people have the natural capacity, that capacity has to be developed through leisure time and appropriate education. The German conceit is that everybody has certain capacities, reasonableness, rationality, that unless they are actively frustrated, are likely to develop in human beings. And that these natural capacities, if you have them, will cause us to converge on a particular principle. Maybe it's a categorical imperative, maybe it's a notion of the nation, maybe it's a notion of God's will or a natural law, but some principle or set of principles or set of rules that we'll all come to if our reason and our rationality is fully developed, right? So all the state then needs to do is allow these human capacities to develop and unfold. But there's still this question of, well, what does this allowing involve? And how much does the state have to intervene for people's reasonable, rational qualities to fully manifest? And in a lot of the early incarnations of the German idea of freedom, it's a pretty limited role for the state. The emphasis is on, everybody has reasonableness, everybody has rationality. And if we just don't get in the way of those things, gradually over time, there will be an unfolding. But as we move through the 1800s and 1900s, more theorists become concerned that left to its own devices, this reasonableness or rationality will not fully develop, and that the state will have to get involved. And so then that introduces the possibility that German freedom is a slippery slope towards some kind of totalitarianism. So here's a kind of range of views, starting with, on the one hand, Tocqueville, who suggests that private civil society organizations can adequately develop people, and if the state gets involved, it's going to cause a lot of trouble. And Tocqueville specifically is saying this in reference to the American case. Tocqueville lauds American private civil society organizations, small local government institutions. He thinks these things do a bang-up job of allowing people's reason and rationality to develop, and that you don't want the state messing about in all of that. Then you've got Max Weber, who says, well, you do have to ensure access to quality education. And Weber has this concern about maturity, this idea that people might choose values for themselves, but they might not realize that their ability to choose values depends on the state and the state's preservation of their freedom. And when we're talking about the state's preservation of their freedom, we're talking about preserving that freedom from other states. So for instance, the German state protects the citizens from having to live under the French state or the Russian state or some other state conquering or subjugating or rendering them second class. And so if the citizens pursue their conceptualizations of freedom at the expense of the continued survival of the German state, for Weber, that puts all of the freedom of everyone in danger, insofar as it can lead to state collapse, civil war, conquest by external states. And therefore, for Weber, you need a kind of patriotic, civic-oriented education to ensure that people's values that they choose for themselves are always compatible with the continued survival of the state. To take things a step further, we've got Rawls. Rawls argues that there's a set of primary goods you need access to be able to fully develop your capacities, your two moral powers of reasonableness and rationality. Now, that set of primary goods is not nearly as elaborate as, say, what Plato or Aristotle argues you need for virtue. It's still much more restricted than Platonic or Aristotelian socioeconomic prerequisites. But it is significantly broader than what you get in Tocqueville or Weber. The next step up further from that, I would posit, would be Habermas, who argues that you need to produce a fully informed ideal deliberation. And so when we're talking about an ideal deliberation, now the state is trying to construct the way that we discuss, right? The way that we interact with each other so that these reasonable, rational qualities will win out through the discussion. So here, there's an acknowledgement that if you don't curate that discussion, those qualities might not win out, and you might get into a negative discussion that produces worse and worse positions over time. So then you've got a significant involvement of the state, not just in, say, the provision of basic primary goods like access to a university setting or access to your basic food, energy, water, but now we're also talking about cultural intervention, structuring the way that the debate, the public debate, the conversation is conducted. And then, of course, a step up from that would be something like what you might associate with Maoism or Stalinism, a kind of cradle-to-grave curation of culture by the state in a totalizing way. Marx, during this period, critiques the positions of Constant and Kant. He makes the point that under capitalism, the worker's ends are chosen by the employer. The employer decides what the worker will do with their time, what the worker will make, and the worker doesn't get to exercise their creative capacities and choose what to make. So the worker is prevented even from having, say, the vulgar ends, because the worker doesn't even get to decide what it is that they're producing. And whether they produce something for the purposes of making money or for the purposes of making something that they consider to be intrinsically good or valuable. The worker is forced to defer completely to the employer. And the employer's ends are overdetermined by the capitalist system. So a corporation which tries to pursue the good or tries to produce things in a virtuous way, that company won't be able to compete in the long run with a company that just makes whatever it is that generates the most profit. So even the employer doesn't get a real choice about what to make or how to make it or for what reasons to make it. So in this system, if the worker doesn't get to choose their own ends and the employer's ends are overdetermined, there's really no human being who is free. No human being gets to choose their own ends. And the workers end up spending the bulk of their free time on amusement, on mass entertainment, on various kinds of opiates, things that allow them to keep working, but not things that help them to develop their capacities in either, say, an Aristotelian sense or a Kantian sense. Now, this critique has a very serious effect on the debates about liberty. And as we move into the Cold War, there's a need to kind of put these critiques to bed in the United States. And in this vacuum, we get Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin tries to bring us back to Benjamin Constant's dichotomous presentation of the concept. And he does this with a very sharp distinction between positive liberty and negative liberty. And here, these conceptualizations of liberty are not really grounded on some kind of historical political economy. So in Constant's schema, ancient liberty comes out of a political economy that's based on war, and modern liberty comes out of a political economy that's based on trade. In Berlin's schema, that kind of grounding on conditions really disappears. And what you get is a more philosophical, analytic distinction between positive liberty, which is freedom to do stuff, and negative liberty, which is freedom from interference in what you do. This way of presenting liberty is the standard way that liberty gets presented in American universities to students, especially undergraduate students. It is often the starting point, even in British universities, for discussions about liberty. You have to be in a pretty posh setting to even get, say, Benjamin Constant's distinction. And this is in part because Benjamin Constant's distinction is clearly based on certain claims about what's different between the ancient world and the modern world, claims that you can potentially interrogate, claims that you can play with, claims that Constant himself plays with and worries about and isn't sure about. Berlin's project is straightforwardly a Cold War project. And at this point, there's a lot of scholarship on Berlin, which makes the case that Berlin's whole project was motivated by anti-communism and a desire to suppress left-wing and Marxist ideas in the Anglosphere. It's very propagandistic. It's only in the last few decades that political theorists have started to dig themselves out from this dichotomous schema. And one very prominent example of this digging out is Quentin Skinner. Quentin Skinner argues that what Isaiah Berlin does is he conflates two different kinds of liberty together: self-realization and non-domination. So for Berlin, part of the problem with positive liberty is if you're saying, well, you have the freedom to do something, well, someone might say that you have the freedom to become what you're meant to become or what you're supposed to be. And then in the name of saying that they're helping you become what you're supposed to be, they might coerce you and make you do all kinds of stuff that otherwise you wouldn't choose to do. Right? In other words, they might do something like what Habermas or Mao would do, where they heavily intervene in your life and in the kinds of discussions that you have to get you to develop in the way that they think you ought to develop. And so for Berlin, that positive liberty is not a very defensible kind of liberty because it is compatible with totalitarianism. And so the worry for Berlin is that those who prefer positive liberty, that will be a slippery slope that will lead inexorably into the kinds of positions we associate with state-centric Marxists, with the Soviet Union and with communist China. Skinner makes the point that you can be interested in something like an ancient view of liberty without being committed to a very thick notion of self-realization. So for instance, in Aristotle's schema, you're being given the capacities to choose your own values, not necessarily the capacities to submit to some principle, right? The self-realization view that we associate with Kant, eventually you're supposed to converge on a principle. You're supposed to freely choose this principle, but it's the principle that's supposed to ultimately be obvious to all of us. If we develop our reason and we develop our rationality, on a Kantian view, this principle is supposed to become obvious to us. And so if you say, well, there is some one principle that we will all converge upon, if we all think about things in the right way, that's in the self-realization direction. The non-domination direction is more open-ended, insofar as non-domination is a little bit more similar to non-interference, in that it's a non. It's something that is someone else is not supposed to do to you. But what is domination? Well, domination is making you a slave. So Skinner is trying to tow us back into the direction of thinking about what is a slave and what does it mean to not be a slave. And in that respect, he's trying to get us to think more like the ancient theorists that Skinner is quite fond of. As a historian of political thought, Skinner is a big fan of liberty before liberalism. Now, the trouble is, once we go back into this question of, well, what does domination mean? And what does slavery mean? We don't necessarily just come back to ancient Republican Aristotelian conceptions of slavery. Aristotle's understanding of slavery is very wide, and there's no chance that any kind of liberal capitalist state is going to be able to claim that it delivers universal liberty or universal freedom from slavery in Aristotle's sense. So if we're going to start talking about slavery and domination, the only way that that can be compatible with a liberal capitalist state is for the meaning of slavery to be changed in some way. It's got to be something more specific, more narrow, or less clear and blurrier than the notion of slavery that we get from Aristotle, which is very clear, very straightforward, and very schematic. So here are a few of the ways that this can be played with. Maybe when we're dominated, we depend on another's arbitrary power. A lot of contemporary political theorists interested in domination make this argument. Now that then kicks the discussion to the concept of arbitrary. What does it mean to be arbitrary, right? Now, you can define arbitrary very narrowly, very narrowly. I mean, it can be said that a king's power isn't arbitrary insofar as a king's power is based on some set of constitutional law, or insofar as a king's power is based on a consensus, right? You could start to fudge arbitrary to the point where it becomes a very minimal constraint on the power of other people. You can insist that the one that you are dependent on has to be a specific individual, right? It can't be something like capitalism or the market or a system of structural incentives. You know, for Aristotle, if you're thinking in terms of what makes money or what will make you higher status, you know, in some way you are not fully realizing, you know, what the value is of human acts, of human crafts, of what human beings do, and that failure to realize that in, say, the work of Frankfurt School theorists like Theodor Adorno is very much baked into the capitalist incentive structure, what capitalism rewards, the fact that capitalism rewards what makes money and what's profitable. If you can only be dominated if there's a specific person doing the dominating, it then becomes possible to have your ends overdetermined by capitalism without being able to say that capitalism is itself a dominating relation, right? You could also just say, well, you can only be dominated if you are someone's legal property. You can straightforwardly try to define this very, very narrowly, de-emphasizing informal obstacles to liberty and contrasting African-American chattel slavery with wage labor. And I think this is the big difference between liberty in the United States and liberty in Europe. In the United States, when we say slavery, people think of African-American slaves. They think of people who are literally the property of individual masters. And they think about the Civil War, and they think of the Civil War as a war between a slave system and a system based on freedom. That's certainly the way it's presented in American schools, right? So if the North is the free system and the South is the slave system, then the wage earners in the North are free people. And if you're going to present the victory of the North over the South as a victory of freedom over slavery, then that defines all the labor relations that occurred in the North as free relations. And they're free relations because the wage earners in the North can freely choose where to work, right? Because they're not owned by particular people. So in the United States, slavery is very much tied to some specific person has to own you, and you have to not have the option to work for someone else. Now, it's very easy to meet the standard of, you know, no particular person owns you. If just being a wage earner very clearly gets you out of slavery, then liberty is a very, very low bar that it's very easy to clear. In contrast, in Europe, when people think about slavery in a European setting, they tend to think about Greco-Roman slaves, and they tend to think about ancient conceptualizations of slavery. They tend to think about people who are unable to choose ends for themselves or to be autonomous. And there's more of an emphasis on the ways in which Greco-Roman slaves are similar to modern wage earners than on the ways in which they're different. And I think for this reason, Marxism has been much more successful in Europe because Marxism gestures at notions of freedom and slavery that are more intuitive from a European standpoint than from the American standpoint. In particular, Marxist arguments about wage slavery were used in the United States by Southern plantation owners to justify their slavery as more honest or more humane than the labor relationships that prevailed in the North. And so because of that association between that analogy and the South and Southern plantation owners, Marxist arguments concerning wage slavery are more easily perceived in the United States as excuses for African-American chattel slavery. And in this way, the class cause and the racial cause are put in opposition to one another and treated as antagonistic. So in this way, even though Skinner has brought back the concept of domination and the focus on non-domination, I think in the United States, because slavery is not understood in this broad, all-encompassing way, but in this quite narrow, limited way, bringing us back to domination tends to just kind of allow the discussion to keep going and allow more conceptualizations of liberty to be posited, right? And so kind of to describe a path here of how this conceptual development evolves, we start with an important abstraction that's too demanding to legitimate the state effectively. You know, Aristotle's conception of freedom, it's too demanding to legitimate a democracy that's meant to be egalitarian effectively. So if you conceptualize the abstraction through a dichotomy that negates the demanding form of that abstraction, saying that you shouldn't understand it in this demanding way because that demanding way will have other further negative consequences, that it leads to a society based on war, or it leads inexorably to a totalitarian society, right? If you say that the demanding version actually will lead to a worse outcome in the long run, you're then able to emphasize a less demanding conceptualization. Now, over time, that dichotomy becomes frustrating for the theorist. The theorist feels like it's a straitjacket and wants to get out of that dichotomy and bring back the things that that dichotomy excludes, which we see in Skinner, right? Once that happens, complexity can be fetishized for its own sake, and the term can be overcomplicated in the name of doing right by it. So at this point, contemporary political theorists are playing with what domination means. And it's gotten to the point where when you mention domination in any kind of academic political theory, people go, well, what on earth does that mean? And how on earth are you going to negotiate all the different ways of understanding domination that have been recently kicked up in the literature? And it becomes a bog, a swamp in which people get stuck. And so instead of being a term that allows you to articulate clear, obvious political demands, it becomes a big mess. And no one knows what it means. Once nobody knows what it means, it becomes a buzzword, and it becomes harder and harder to use it. When the term is completely exhausted, when nobody knows what it means, and you can't use it effectively at all in conversation, at that point, you have to replace it with some other very demanding term. You have to come up with some other word that does seem to have a clear meaning. And when that happens, you'll come back to the start of this again. You'll then have a term that has a meaning that's too demanding to legitimate the state effectively. And then people will start to play with what that term means to try and make it into something that's more politically tractable for the state. And so in this way, Skinner's project of trying to go back to a different word that in ancient times had a clearer meaning can be endlessly frustrated and turned inward against itself. And so while I think Skinner, and he continues to give a very popular lecture where he introduces these different conceptualizations of liberty and traces their history and positions them in relation to each other. I've attended that lecture, I've been at it. It's a very nice talk. The trouble is you cannot, simply by unearthing an old conceptualization, get people to use that conceptualization in that way. Over time, people who have the power and influence to determine what gets published and what doesn't will water down and twist these terms so that these terms affirm the power structures that they lead. And so over time, even when you try to go back to some ancient Aristotelian conception, you're going to end up back in the same situation of needing a conceptualization of slavery, of domination, of liberty, of freedom that's compatible with the kind of society that we have, that allows people to look at our society and go, this is a free society where I have liberty and I'm not dominated. And so you can't just word salad your way out of it. There's a power structure here that compels liberty to be understood in this not very demanding way. And until we're out of the power situation that causes liberty to have these conceptualizations and these meanings, attempts to get out will tend inexorably to be turned back on themselves and to reproduce the same thing with additional layers of cover. So I'll end here for today, and we'll go to questions, comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Does anybody have any burning questions they'd like to ask first? Angus looks like he has a question. No. Any thoughts?
Hi, Ben. It's kind of like a side question, I guess. I just wanted to know what you thought about. I was really interested in the point you kind of made as a kind of aside about the question of race being placed in antagonism with class in those contexts. And I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess I wanted to ask what you thought about the relationship between post-colonialism and Marxism in this regard. I guess I'm also thinking of like Vivek Chiba's arguments. I'm sure you know those, but like this debate around whether like this has done a disservice, because presumably what you're indicating there is that, you know, we need to think about these things together, and the trick has been the kind of split there that's kind of split those things apart. So, and then I guess to put the question in a more provocative way, maybe I was wondering whether post-colonialism and a lot of the race discourse is an example of a liberty story which ignores the kind of class underpinnings of what's actually happening and presents itself as a liberty story, a kind of like the kind of legitimation stories that you were talking about last week. So I just wondered what you thought about that kind of position.
Yeah, so in the States, it's been quite effective to talk about African American chattel slavery as a way of watering down the standard for what it means to be free, emphasizing the awfulness of the conditions of African American chattel slaves causes people to appreciate what they have and the fact that they're not in that situation. There has been an attempt to import this kind of discussion into Europe to weaken the position of Marxists in Europe. This happens by importing the American racial discussion and American racial issues in the European context. It also happens through post-colonialism and the emphasis on the worst situation that the post-colonial subject is in. When you're talking about the fact that the post-colonial subject is in a worse situation, you could say, well, that's slavery, and by contrast, what you have is freedom. And I think that is a way of trying to reproduce the discussion in the United States. In the same way that in the United States, the Civil War and American slavery is now more than 150 years ago. But by constantly referencing this historical division, you're able to weaken it. In the same way, decolonization is something that only happened a relatively short time ago, much more recently than the end of slavery in the United States. And I think easily for the next 100 or 200 years in Europe, it could be the case that decolonization is brought up as, see, aren't you privileged? You benefited from the imperial period. You benefited from colonialism. You, the worker, are way better off than you would have been if you were the colonial subject. And that kind of discussion can keep going, especially as long as in European countries, as in the United States, there's a real difference economically in the median income of people who are from the group that was formerly straightforwardly enslaved or straightforwardly the colonial subject. And so in this way, perpetuating inequalities of wealth and income on a racial basis or an ethnic basis can be used to keep a kind of living memory of this distinction alive and to further water down the expectations of those who believe themselves to be beneficiaries.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's right.
I have a question if anybody else doesn't have one. I don't want to take up anybody's chance of asking a question because I feel like I ask Benjamin questions all the time. So my question for you, Benjamin, is this idea of liberty. Do you think part of the issues with our kind of current regime in the West is to do with this idea of liberty, that there's a promise of liberty without the downside, without sacrifice? Do you think that's something that is sold to us and that leads to political issues?
Well, I think in the States, there's often constantly an emphasis on the price of liberty. Freedom isn't free, and you've got to be thankful to the veterans who fought the wars, who preserved your freedom from those who would take it from you. Who are those who would take it from you? The Nazis, the communists, the Southern plantation owners. There's always somebody who's after your freedom, and that, again, is meant to water down the notion of what you'll take to be freedom. Similarly, this idea that you've got to work for stuff in the States, this emphasis on if you want to be someone who has leisure time, you have to earn it, and you have to demonstrate that you deserve it through merit. And the way to do that is participation in the market. It means that ultimately the only people who get the opportunities to cultivate virtue, better themselves, are people who have completely subordinated themselves to the market for the purposes of making money And so when they do end up with that free time, they have no notion of how to use it, because the only way that they accumulated enough money to have that time was to adopt a completely vulgar attitude.
So part of the way that we avoid contemplating value generation is through external threats.
Yeah.
And do you think that partly what's going on in America at the moment is that the threat has gone from external to internal?
Yeah. I do think there has been an effort in the United States to try to frame a kind of neo-Marxism, to suggest that there's some kind of European Frankfurt School thing that is infecting the United States. That's been tried in recent years. Islamic terrorism was tried. There's been a lot of different kind of outside threats to freedom that have been posited in the couple of decades following the fall of the Soviet Union. None of them have stuck very effectively. And so that's leading to more internal conflict and a deeper chronic crisis as people start to look at other people in the country as enemies of their freedom. The emphasis on the Southern plantation owner that we're seeing revived in recent years is a kind of internal looking inward for internal threats to freedom. And I think we're seeing that in Europe now through the post-colonial discourse, looking at the internal threat to freedom in your own society. And then, something like the Democratic Party or a Social Democratic Party protects you from that internal threat to freedom, prevents the bad party from winning and imposing the historical kind of slavery that it's supposed that they would impose if they ever got power.
Awesome. I have another question. Again, I do not want to dominate. So if anybody does have a question, please go before me. If you don't,
I have one,
okay,
if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
I have two, actually. So I'm going to try to make it concise. But I was thinking in US, what do you think of the role of anarchist thought, especially in relation with freedom, and especially with the role that anarchist theory and action had in relation with the unions, with the social movements, the direct action that they use, and also in relation with, for example, how Bakunin thought about freedom in relation that how he presents society is basically in these relations of domination that are not only in economical aspect or in economical relations that the boss and the employee, but also in family, in gender, in race. And I think that in some aspect it's more broad than the Marxist approach to these kind of relations. But I was thinking, and also the role that these ideas of liberty that came from anarchism, especially in the US, have merged in a way with capitalism, with this anarcho-capitalist movement now, that it's really different from the traditional perspective about liberty and freedom, that it's, at least in Bakunin and others, it's more a relational thing. Like, I can be free if the other is not free. But in the anarcho-capitalist movement now, it's all about, no, I have to be free and I have to reject the state. And also the second question is, what do you think about how the idea of liberty start to play maybe in with different positions? For example, with the discussion around guns, that is, no, it's my right to have guns and I have to fight for that, in contrast with all the problems with the abortion rights. That is, okay, I can have my gun, but you can have an abortion. And it has this different approach to a similar problem in terms of what I can do like an individual. And in one case, I defend it, but in other, I reject that possibility. So those two questions.
Yeah, I think anarchism has had a much stronger impact on the left in the United States than in Europe. I think a big part of the reason why is this dichotomy that Berlin draws up between negative and positive liberty. Positive liberty is pitched as a kind of slippery slope. Now, Berlin is going to say, well, you do need some of it, but it's a slippery slope, so you need to be careful about how much. The anti-communists are going to lean very heavily into a fetishized account of negative liberty, in which it's hardcore freedom from interference. That's what freedom is. And when people start claiming freedoms too, they're positing unnatural other kinds of freedom for the purposes of ultimately somehow imposing a communism and enslaving it. So because of that, I think there has been a much greater emphasis in the United States on non-interference, on separateness. And so therefore, oftentimes, even when people are trying to do this from the left, they're heavily influenced by this concept of non-interference, to the point where many American left-wing formations are really non-interference focused. Part of the reason that anarchism is so influential is that the Aristotelian account, it requires very careful curation by the state because it treats freedom as this vulnerable, tricky thing that's hard to get, that people have some ability to pursue, but only if they're helped in certain very specific ways. The anarchists tend to view freedom as something that's already in us that we just have to dig out. In a way similar to the Stoics. The Stoics make this argument in antiquity that we all have the capacity to reason. And indeed, insofar as we think that our desires are ruling us, we're mistaken. We are choosing through our reason to endorse those ends. And that reason kind of reigns supreme in the soul, just by default, without any particular social help. And so for the Stoics, you can't say, oh, I need certain things from the society to be a virtuous person. The Stoics will insist that every person has an inherent reasoning capability and therefore an inherent ability to be virtuous and free, regardless of the circumstances. That idea is extremely popular in the States, especially among people who feel that there is really no political home for them in the two-party system, that they have no access to any kind of organization that would enable them to make effective political demands. And in a situation where the unions are very weak, where there's been erosion for about 50 years of civil society organizations of every kind, including churches, it is really a safe place for people to come to this idea that they have in themselves somewhere a freedom that the society will otherwise not supply to them. And so there's a constant revival of a Stoic notion of you just have to look inside yourself and find yourself and self-actualize. Existentialist philosophy, self-reliance theorists like Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson are taught in American high schools. That stuff has a lot of purchase among ordinary Americans.
I have a question about how this relates to art, if anybody else doesn't want to. Something that I'm curious about is how do we rationalize ideologically in our current system who gets to be free to pursue intellectual or artistic pursuits in life?
Yeah, so there's a pitch that it's meritocratic, but that pitch also conflicts with a different pitch, which is that in some ways it's making up for the slavery of the past. So if your work contributes in some way to rectifying this history of non-freedom, then that in and of itself makes it meritorious work. And that can be because of the content of the work, but it can also just be because of who made the work. If the very fact that the work is made by someone who is a descendant of a slave makes the work in some way emancipatory because it means that someone who's a descendant of a slave is enjoying freedom, and therefore the distribution of freedom is less based on the consequences of slavery, that itself has become a mechanic in the United States that you can argue for. Those things are constantly in tension. The Republican Party generally prefers a kind of merit-driven mechanic, but its notion of merit is very much caught up in the market and in what makes money and in what's profitable. It wants to evaluate university degrees by their economic consequences. And the left, which is increasingly historically focused on righting this wrong of past slavery rather than on delivering freedom now to everybody.
Yeah, and I guess because we talked about that quite a lot, how you know, a cover story is to look at past wrongs as if they are the key issues in the present, to avoid the key issues in the present. Jonathan, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I'm just wondering about when you talk about it in the United States, we have that constant contrast with chattel slavery, right? To make working conditions not seem like a form of slavery or to seem better. Do you think that applies to the sort of third world exploitation? Because we almost live in an Aristotelian society where we only have leisure time, both because of the wage slavery in our own countries, but much more our exploitation of other countries. And I think if you sort of a lot of people are sort of aware that the conditions, say in a sweatshop or on a sweatshop barge, are much worse. They're much more recognizably closer to chattel slavery. So, do you think this has an impact, or what role does this play in the psyche or in these narratives of legitimation that you're discussing?
Yeah, so I think that has a very important role to play in Europe, because in Europe, the position of the sweatshop worker is there's still some kind of colonialism that's happening to them. They're still in some way the colonial subject. There's a kind of legacy of colonialism, just as in the United States, there's a legacy of slavery that's doing this to them. In the United States, I think that this has less of an impact. In the United States, the focus is on the slavery that occurred in the South to racial minority populations, the mistreatment of racial minority populations in the United States. And the tendency when we talk about sweatshops, I think a lot of Americans think of these countries as in some way taking advantage of their ability to pay workers very little so that they can siphon jobs away from the United States. So there's more in the United States an emphasis on that this is some kind of form of cheating international trade or unfair trade that hurts the American worker. You know, if you talk about outsourcing or offshoring in the United States, the focus isn't on the bad situation endured by the sweatshop laborer. It's on the fact that the factory worker in Ohio was forced to go get a job that pays less, that doesn't have the same kind of pension in, say, the retail sector. I remember 20 years ago, a YouTube video called Big Box Smart. A little song about a guy who used to work for a factory and then his job is outsourced to China. The whole focus of the song is on what it does to him and on how he is being made to pay for China's opportunity to grow and develop. In the United States, because we have this notion that the country was built off the efforts of low-earning wage earners, that is the kind of glorious story of how the United States was developed. That kind of low-wage work is not viewed as slavery. And therefore, when developing countries subject their own populations to that kind of work, I don't think most Americans are viewing it through the slavery lens.
Interesting. Any final questions before we close things off for this week? Go for it.
Yeah, just a last question, but thinking, just to add another perspective and thinking in relation of this dichotomy that you present on how in US and Europe think around slavery, or what is this relation with the contrast with liberty. I think in Latin America it's interesting that after all the social and intellectual movement in the 60s and 70s, and then the different dictatorships, when we think on that, I think automatically is the US intervention in Latin America. And US, it seemed like the honor on Latin America, on the one that took freedom and the possibility of self-determination in Latin America from the 70s, and then with the economical aspect, the political aspect, cultural aspect. So my question in relation with that is, why do you think it's so difficult for US to understand that they also take away freedom from other countries and slave them in a way? And it's always the speech of, no, we are liberating these countries, we are restoring democracy, and our intervention is the best, even if we kill thousands of people. Like, why do you think that they can put themselves in the place of another country that is being invaded from them?
Yeah, the United States pitches itself as having liberated itself from colonialism, from British colonialism, and then it pitches itself as having liberated lots of other parts of the Americas from European colonialism, having liberated Cuba from the Spanish, having liberated the Louisiana Territory from the French, having tried to liberate Canada from the British, but those ungrateful Canadians failing to understand the meaning of freedom. I think that in the case of the United States, the emphasis is it's the Europeans who put down the flags, who ruled and who didn't give a voice, didn't allow representation. The sovereignty of the Latin American countries, the United States imagines it has respected because it never put down flags in those countries. Now, of course, it did put down flags in certain situations in those countries. It certainly has intervened to overthrow governments. That isn't really part of American history. It's not something that most Americans are going to hear about. Generally, American history is focused on the Revolutionary War, in which America liberated itself from the British, the period in between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and then the Civil War, in which America put an end to the hypocrisy of African-American chattel slavery. There's sometimes a little bit of further attention to the world wars or to the civil rights movement. But in all of these cases, America is ending some kind of threat to freedom coming from somebody else or coming from the Southern plantation owners. Only the Southern plantation owners get vilified. And in this way, because the Southern plantation owners are the bad people, the rest of the country is able to imagine that it gets off and doesn't have a role to play. Most Americans aren't aware of the American presence in the Philippines, don't know very much about what goes on in Latin America, couldn't identify most Latin American countries on a map if asked to. And so because the discussion is always focused on the bad Europeans who are trying to take away freedom, or on the bad Southerners who are trying to act like Europeans, there really isn't a whole lot of scope for the United States as the colonizer state. There's been more discussion in recent years of it, but within a relatively narrow fringe of the American political spectrum. And it tends to be done in this kind of very morally accusatory way, where it's not just that the American state is doing this, it's that you're doing it with your complicity. And because it has this kind of adversarial dynamic, a lot of Americans feel attacked by it on a personal level, morally accused by it, and so don't want to engage with it.
Perfect. So Angus has his hand raised. So do you want to ask this question as your last question? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. As I mentioned before, I'm pretty ignorant about all this stuff. But two things that have been going through my mind, they're interconnected, is we've kind of been using the word liberty and freedom interchangeably. In Canada, when we get in these discussions, we sort of see a distinction between freedom and liberty, or it becomes that way in terms of liberty is by rights granted to us or by God or the government, and freedom as just the freedom to be independent, free choice. And in trying to wrestle with that, maybe, I hope these are brief questions that you can resolve that, but then it brings me to the quote you said earlier, liberty before liberation. I've never heard that before. It sounds wonderful, but I really can't conceive of that in a place where it seems that our liberties are granted to us as rights, how that could work.
Yeah, so the reference there was to Liberty Before Liberalism, which is a book by Quentin Skinner in which he traces the forms that liberty took before liberalism as a school of thought came on the scene in the history of political thought. So oftentimes people like to do this kind of game where they'll say, liberty means this thing and freedom means that thing. And by kind of nailing it down and giving it a single definition, you can put to bed further debate over how to conceptualize the terms. I tend to use liberty and freedom interchangeably because they can both be conceptualized in similar kinds of ways or in different kinds of ways. So in the schema that you offer there, liberty is kind of framed in terms of positive liberty, in terms of rights given to you, things that you can do. And freedom is framed in a more negative way in terms of not depending on other people or not being interfered with. It's a kind of way of doing the positive negative liberty distinction. But if you frame positive and negative liberty as two types of liberty, that might invite you to think, well, maybe there's a third type. Maybe there's not just two types. Why are we thinking about it in terms of two types? If you instead say liberty means this one thing and only this one thing, and freedom means just this one thing and only this one thing, the invitation to further conceptualize those concepts and think about other ways they might be understood is foreclosed by a textbook definition. And so if you're really trying to impose a particular view on people, you don't even introduce them to a dichotomy. You give them a textbook definition that's singular and completely foreclosed. Often in the States, the dichotomous definition is introduced in undergrad as a kind of complication of what might previously have been a textbook definition, or not even something that you would discuss in high school, because attempting to discuss what freedom or liberty means in a public high school is very politically fraught and difficult. So in undergrad, you get what appears to be the beginning of a rich discussion through a dichotomy, but the dichotomy is the appearance of complexity without the thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time and expertise. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Angus, did you want to have a continuation of that question?
Only in terms of the title of that book, Liberty Before Liberalism. Is it also, is there a possibility of that in a modern Western environment, I guess? Or is that, I think that's like, is there a possibility of that? I just can't imagine that, I guess.
Yeah, it's an attempt to revive the ways of thinking about liberty that we might associate with someone like Aristotle, or with some of the kind of early Republican theorists of liberty. Some of the Italian city-state Renaissance era political theorists. Quentin Skinner really likes Greeks, Romans, and Renaissance Italians. And he's very interested in how they conceptualize liberty and freedom. And in trying to say that there was something meaningful about the way in which they conceptualized it, not only that it is a valid form of freedom, but on his view, it's a more demanding form of freedom than the kinds of freedom that we have today. The issue with those forms of freedom is that even in the periods when they were widespread and when they were the way in which people tended to think about these terms, they were not at all conceptualizations that everyone could easily participate in, because they were so demanding. It required such a level of free time, a level of education, a level of political participation. It's very hard to give to everybody because of the scarcity of time, because of the scarcity of meaningful political power. It's very hard to give someone a meaningful voice. You can give someone a token voice or a vote that's won in millions and millions of votes, but it's very hard to give people the kind of really substantive freedom that you'd see in an ancient city-state where there's a very small citizen population with maybe a property qualification for being a citizen, with women potentially excluded from citizenship or given only a passive kind of secondary citizenship. The issue with ancient citizenship is that and ancient freedom is that it's never been something that can easily be universalized. If you come up with a version of freedom you can universalize, to do that, you have to water it down in ways that may make it feel tokenistic or overtly ideological. And this is, I think, the dilemma that we've been in with freedom, that we have not yet found a way out of. But of course, if you confront that we haven't found a way out of it, then you have to be dissatisfied, not just with this society, but with all societies that have existed.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. That's a good summary. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Benjamin. I really appreciate it again, and looking forward to the next installment next Sunday. Yeah, and thanks for coming, everybody. See you soon.